Now, international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman joins me in studio, and Alyami, director for the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia. Thank you so much, the both of you, for joining me today. Now, Ali, I want to start with you. What is the main thing to take away from this debate? Could it result in any real change?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for keeping this issue in front of the public, not just for the Saudis and the Middle Eastern people, but for the international community. It's very important that that discussion continues. The United Nations as a whole is a useless organization in terms of human rights or any other issues. Most of the members of the General Assembly are ruled by dictatorships that share the same values and views of the Saudi regime's human rights issues. Many of the Muslim and Arab countries in the UN are about the same as the Saudis in terms of their practices at home, but they are also recipient of Saudi largesse. So I don't really expect much other than big talks in Geneva or in New York and the United Nations corridors. The key to this issue is what the West, the United States and European democracies are going to do, whether it is about Jamal Khashoggi gruesome assassination and disappearance, or the devastating war in Yemen. So the power and the key is in the hands of the U.S. and European governments.
Right. Now, I want to bring Owen Alterman into this conversation. As I mentioned earlier, this is very procedural. It happens every 4 years for every member country. So is it a coincidence that this is coming up now?
Absolute coincidence, Lauren, and not a happy coincidence, I suspect, for the poor Saudi ambassador who had to sit in the room through all of this. Look, as you mentioned, this is a universal periodic review. A few dozen UN countries have to go through this every 4 years. All UN member states should say go through this once every 4 years. A few dozen countries during every cycle. By coincidence, happens just after the Khashoggi killing. The reality, at the end of the day, Lauren, not much will come out of this. We here in Israel know that very little ends up coming out of the Human Rights Council sessions. Often there are resolutions that are hostile to Israel from those sessions, but they don't tend to get implemented in concrete actions very often. But again, it does keep this in the public eye. It does put the U.S. ambassador there on the record with that very strong statement we heard about a premeditated killing and setting out markers for what the investigation must show. And then one by one, the representatives of many of the Western states and others came and said what they had to say about not only about the Khashoggi killing, but importantly, as our guest said, about the war in Yemen.
Well, Ali, I want to ask you, is Mohammed bin Salman the biggest threat in and to Saudi Arabia's image and diplomatic ties right now?
He's a threat to the Saudi image, but the Saudis, the Saudi government doesn't really care as much as, or as long as they get Western staunch support for Prince Mohammed and for his family. So the image is irrelevant. They care. Everybody cares about their image, as you know, especially exposure of brutalities and injustices. But image is secondary to the real issue, and the real issue is how long can the West continue to be silent, look the other way, or support the Saudi regime's domestic and foreign policies. This is the key issue to the situation inside Saudi Arabia and the Saudi policies in general.
Owen, 10,000 people have already died in the war in Yemen. What could bring it to an end?
Look, policy changes by Saudi Arabia, policy changes by Iran. It's obviously not a simple conflict to resolve because both sides have to take steps and be confident in what the other is doing. Going back to what we were saying before, as our guest mentioned, the key is going to be what the U.S. and the European Union do on Saudi Arabia's human rights record. That's not necessarily answered today at the Human Rights Council, although it is important to say that those statements that we heard from the U.S. ambassador and from others may point in the direction of what those governments plan to do. But again, Lauren, there often is a gap between the rhetoric and the concrete action, and that's what everyone is going to be watching in the weeks and months ahead.
Ali, do you believe that we will ever find out what really happened to Khashoggi's remains? Will we ever see them? Will they be returned to his family?
Could you repeat that, please? Sorry.
I was asking you if you believe that we will find out what happened to Jamal Khashoggi's remains. Will they be returned to his family for a proper burial?
Based on what we know in the articles that we have been reading, but also the Turkish government statements, Khashoggi body was dismembered and either thrown away in some place where nobody could find him, or the last report that was divulged was his body was dissolved in acid. I don't think his body is anywhere to be found, and I don't think we will find out exactly what happened to him other than what we have heard. It is a tragedy. It is a hole that the Saudi regime dug for itself. They cannot get out of it easily, and whether they get support from Western superpowers or not, I think the message that the people and the information that the people have learned about the Saudi system and its policies are going to last very, very long time. And frankly speaking, I don't think people at any time in the near future will ever forget or accept the Saudi explanation. It doesn't make any difference what they say, how much money they spent, how much Saudi oil they sent to Washington and London and Paris and other places to explain their side of the story, because the damage is done, and I don't think this is going to be easily swept away under the carpet.